The galaxy, vast and ancient, had known peace for 300 standard cycles. Not the fragile, negotiated truce of weary diplomats, but the profound, echoing silence that follows a cataclysm finally spent. The Great Convergence War, the conflict that had scorched nebulae and shattered star systems, was over. History books meticulously curated by the triumphant Concord of harmonious spheres recorded its conclusion with sterile finality. The Deathworlder uprising was quelled. Order restored. The cycle of violence broken. But history, as always, is written by the victors. And the victors had forgotten one small, stubborn detail. They forgot to tell them. On the rain-lashed, iron-rich plains of Veridia Prime, humanity hadn't received the memo. They'd been fighting for 3 centuries. Not for conquest, not for ideology, but for the simple, brutal arithmetic of survival. Their world, a death world as the galaxy chillingly termed it, was a crucible of relentless hostility. Acid storms scoured the landscape. Predators with chitinous hides and venomous spines stalked the twilight. The very air, thick with spores and metallic tang, could kill the unprepared in hours. Humanity hadn't chosen this war. The war had chosen them, and they'd learned to fight back with a ferocity that bordered on the pathological. Commander Aris Thorne stood on the observation blister of Outpost Gamma 7, his knuckles white on the reinforced plexus steel. Below, the Viridian dusk bled into night, painting the jagged silhouettes of the Razorback Mountains in shades of bruised purple and blood red. Rain, sharp as needles, drummed a relentless tattoo on the dome. Inside, the air hummed with the low thrum of life support and the tense silence of soldiers who knew the storm outside was merely the prelude. Status, kill. Aris's voice was gravel scraped raw by Viridian dust and decades of command. He didn't turn. His eyes, the color of weathered flint, scanned the thermal overlay on the main display. Flickering heat signatures, large, fast-moving, wrong, pulsed at the edge of the sensor range. The Skitterers. Always the Skitterers. Calvos, his second-in-command, leaned over the comms console, her face illuminated by the sickly green glow of the screens. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe braid, but strands clung damply to her temples. Perimeter sensors are screaming, Commander. Swarm pattern Delta, bigger than last week's. They're probing the eastern flank again. Her voice was tight, controlled, but the tremor beneath it was unmistakable. Fear wasn't weakness here, it was data. Shields holding at 87%. Power draw from the geothermal taps is stable, for now. Aris finally turned. His face was a map of hard lines and older scars, one bisecting his left eyebrow, another pulling the corner of his mouth into a permanent grimace. He looked older than his 40 standard years, worn down by the constant attrition of Veridia. Stable was a luxury they rarely afforded. Sound the alert, full combat readiness. And Kale, he paused, his gaze locking onto hers. Hell, the medbay to prep the trauma wards. Again, the klaxon's wail cut through the outpost's heme, a sound as familiar as breath. Boots pounded on metal grates, hatches sealed with hydraulic hisses. The quiet tension shattered, replaced by the orchestrated chaos of imminent battle. Aris watched his people move, lean, hardened, eyes sharp with the hyper-awareness of those who lived one skirmish at a time. They weren't soldiers in the galactic sense. They were survivors. Every scar, every callus, every haunted look in their eyes was a testament to a war they didn't understand the origin of, only its brutal daily reality. Why do they keep coming? The question gnawed at him, a constant companion in the quiet moments between engagements. The Skitterers weren't mindless beasts. Their attacks were coordinated, adaptive, almost strategic. It made no sense. Veridia Prime held no strategic value. The galaxy cared about. It was a rock, a poisonous resource-poor rock orbiting a dim red dwarf. Why pour endless biomass into this meat grinder? Light years away aboard the sleek organic curves of the Concord Envoy vessel Whisper of Accord, High Arbiter Zor'lak observed Veridia Prime through a viewscreen that rendered the planet in serene, false-color tranquility. To Zor'lak's multifaceted eyes, the world was a smudge of insignificant green and brown against the velvet black, peaceful. Another minor disturbance registered on the surface. Arbiter, intoned Sub-Executor Veln. His voice a dry rustle of chitin. Veln's carapace, polished obsidian, gleamed under the soft ambient light of the bridge. His multiple limbs moved with precise, economical grace as he manipulated holographic data streams. Localized biosignatures surge, consistent with indigenous fauna activity. The containment protocols appear adequate. Zor'lak pulsed a low-frequency hum of satisfaction. Adequate. That was the cornerstone of Concord policy regarding the Deathworld remnants. Containment. Not eradication, that was wasteful, messy, and carried the faint, unpleasant whiff of the old war's brutality. The Concord prided itself on its enlightened governance, its harmonious resolution of conflicts. The Deathworlders, those savage, unpredictable humans, were a relic, a contained problem. Their continued futile struggle against the planet's own defenses was efficient. It kept them occupied, weak, harmless. "Monitor," Zor'lak commanded, his voice resonating with the deep authority of his caste. "Ensure the energy-dampening field remains active. No signals in, no signals out. The historical record must remain undisturbed." The unspoken truth hung heavy in the recycled air. The galaxy must never know the Deathworlders still fight. It would be an embarrassment. A reminder of a conflict the Concord preferred to forget. A victory they'd rather not scrutinize too closely. The humans weren't just contained, they were erased from the present, fossilized in the past tense of a concluded war. Zor'lak turned his attention to a priority transmission flickering on a secondary screen. A request for resource reallocation from the verdant pleasure world of Lyra's embrace. Trivial. Manageable. The flickering biosignatures on Veridia Prime were merely static on the galactic consciousness, noise to be filtered out. Back on Veridia, the static was screaming. The eastern perimeter wall, a 30-meter-high slab of ferrocrete and layered ablative armor, shuddered under the impact. Not the usual skittering claws, but something heavier. Much heavier. Alarms shrieked a new, more urgent cadence. "Commander, breach attempt at Sector Echo 7? Kale's voice crackled over the comms, laced with disbelief. It's not just Skitterers. Something big is with them." Shield integrity dropping to 6. Aris was already moving, grabbing his pulse rifle from the rack. Its weight was a familiar comfort, an extension of his will. "All units converge on Echo 7. Heavy weapons. Focus fire on the primary breach point. Kale, get the plasma cutters ready on the inner blast doors." He sprinted down the corridor, the klaxon's wail merging with the rising thunder of impacts on the outer hull. The air tasted of ozone and He burst onto the gantry overlooking Sector Echo 7, just as the main shield flickered and died with a shower of sparks. Through the reinforced viewport, the nightmare unfolded. Moonlight, filtered through the acid haze, glinted off a churning sea of chitinous bodies. Skitterers, thousands of them swarming like locusts. But towering above them, wreathed in the smoke of its own passage, was a monstrosity. It stood on 6 articulated legs, each ending in a crushing pincer. Its carapace was thick, scarred, and studded with bioluminescent nodules that pulsed with sickly green light. From its back, barbed tendrils lashed out, embedding themselves in the ferrocrete wall, pulling. Acidic drools sizzled where it struck the ground. "A Titan-class Skitterer," Kale breathed, appearing beside him, her own rifle raised. "Intel said they were extinct after the last major push." "Intel is wrong," Aris growled, sighting down his rifle. "Focus fire on the tendrils. Disrupt its anchor points." He squeezed the trigger. Blue-white bolts of plasma lanced out, striking the thick tendril nearest the command gantry. It recoiled, smoking, but didn't sever. The Titan roared. A sound like grinding boulders, and slammed a massive pincer against the wall. Ferrocrete cracked. Dust rained down. The battle raged for an hour. Plasma bolts lit the night in strobing flashes. Grenades detonated with concussive booms, scattering Skitterer limbs. Human defenders fell, dragged screaming into the chitinous tide, but slowly, agonizingly, they pushed the swarm back. The Titan, its tendrils severed and carapace pitted with plasma burns, finally retreated, dragging its wounded bulk into the darkness, the Skitterers flowing after it like a receding tide of nightmares. Silence descended, broken only by the crackle of dying fires, the moans of the wounded, and the relentless drumming of the acid rain. Aris leaned against the gantry railing, breathing hard, the acrid smell of burnt chitin and blood thick in his nostrils. He surveyed the carnage below, the broken bodies, the scorched earth, the deep gouges in the wall. Victory. Another day survived. Then his eyes caught it. Near the base of the wall, half buried in mud and Skitterer gore, something glinted unnaturally. Not chatin, not metal. Smooth, curved. Alien. He vaulted over the railing, landing heavily in the muck, ignoring Kale's shout. He knelt, wiping away the grime with a gloved hand. It was a disc, about the size of his palm, made of a material that seemed to drink the dim light. Etched into its surface were intricate geometric patterns that shifted subtly as he turned it. And in the center, a symbol, a stylized spiral galaxy, bisected by a single stark line. Recognition, cold and sharp, pierced the fog of battle fatigue. He'd seen this symbol before. Not on Veridia. Not in any human archive. He'd seen it, dreamed it. No, in the fragmented, corrupted data cores salvaged from the ancient, pre-war ruins scattered across the continent. The ruins humanity called the before-time tombs. Ruins that spoke of a time before the endless war, a time of starships and cities that touched the sky. Ruins that hinted at others. This disk wasn't Skitterer tech. It was Concord tech. Official issue. A data wafer. Or a beacon. His blood ran cold. Why would Concord tech be embedded in a Skitterer titan? The implications were terrifying, nonsensical. The Concord was a myth, a ghost story told to scare children into obedience during the long Veridian nights. The galaxy was empty. Humanity was alone in its struggle. Unless they weren't alone. Unless the war wasn't against the planet. Unless the Skitterers weren't the enemy. Aris clutched the disk, its smooth surface suddenly feeling like ice against his skin. The silence of the aftermath wasn't peace. It was the silence of a trap being sprung. The silence of a truth too monstrous to comprehend. He looked up at the stars, hidden behind the acid clouds, and for the first time in his life, felt a terror deeper than any Skitterer horde. What if the war hadn't ended? What if humanity had simply been left behind, fighting a battle no one else remembered or cared about? And then cutting through the rain and the groans of the dying, a new sound, not the klaxon, not the roar of beasts, a high-pitched electronic whine growing rapidly louder, coming from above. Aris's head snapped up. Keel was already shouting into her comm, her face pale. "Commander, unidentified vessel, breaking atmo, fast. It's not ours. It's not Skitterer." The whine became a shriek. A shadow, sleek and utterly alien, blotted out the patch of sky visible between the clouds. It descended with impossible grace, silent except for the tearing of the atmosphere, landing with a soft thump 100 meters from the breached wall. No weapons fired, no hostile energy signatures spiked. Just arrival. The ramp lowered. Figures emerged. Tall, slender, encased in form-fitting armor of iridescent blue chatin that seemed to shift color with their movements. Their faces were obscured by smooth, featureless helmets, but Aris could feel their gaze, cold, assessing, utterly devoid of the desperate fury that defined his own people. They moved with a fluid, predatory grace that spoke of absolute confidence, of superiority. One stepped forward, raising a hand, not in threat. In greeting or command. A synthesized voice, smooth and utterly inhuman, echoed across the ruined battlefield, cutting through the rain like a scalpel. It spoke in standard Galactic, a language Aris only half remembered from the before-time tombs. "Human survivors of Veridia Prime. By decree of the Concord of Harmonious Spheres, your resistance is noted. Your persistence is acknowledged. Cease hostilities immediately. You are hereby ordered to surrender. The Galactic War ended 300 cycles ago. Your continued conflict is illogical and obsolete." Aris Thorn stood amidst the mud and blood of his hard-won victory, the alien disk burning a hole in his pocket, the sleek Concord Envoy ship looming like a tombstone, and the words of the Arbiter echoing in his skull like a death knell. The war ended centuries ago. No one told us we lost. The world tilted. The rain felt like needles of ice. The Skitterers, the acid storms, the endless grinding struggle. It had all been a lie, a cage, and the jailers had just arrived to collect their prisoners. He raised his pulse rifle, its weight suddenly meaningless. His voice, when it came, was a raw scrape of defiance against the crushing weight of revelation. Surrender? To you? The lead Concord officer tilted its head, a gesture that managed to convey infinite condescension. Compliance is mandatory, Deathworlder. Resistance is futile. The outcome was determined long before your ancestors crawled from the mud. Aris's finger tightened on the trigger, not at the Concord officer, at the disk in his pocket, at the symbol of the spiral galaxy bisected by a line, at the 3 centuries of blood spilled for a war that was already over. The silence stretched thick with the unspoken history of genocide and forgotten betrayal. The rain fell. The Concord ship hummed, and Aris Thorne, commander of a lost cause he never knew he was fighting, made his choice. He didn't lower his rifle. He raised it higher, aiming not at the Envoy but at the sky, at the hidden stars, at the galaxy that had abandoned them. Futile, he spat, the word laced with the grit of Veridia. You have no idea what futile looks like. The Concord officer took a step back, its posture shifting subtly. A warning. Do not force our hand, primitive. Aris met the blank visor, his eyes blazing with the cold fire of 300 years of stolen history. You already did. He squeezed the trigger, not at the Concord, at the disk in his hand. The pulse bolt struck the alien artifact, shattering it in a shower of sparks and fragmented data. The effect was instantaneous. Not an explosion, but a pulse. A wave of distorted energy, visible as a ripple in the air, shot outwards from the shattered disk. It washed over the Concord Envoy ship, over the Concord officers, over the ruined outpost. And then, from the darkness beyond the breached wall, from the acid-scarred plains, from the very bones of Veridia Prime came a sound that froze the blood of every human and Concord officer alike. A low, guttural chittering, not the mindless skittering of the usual hordes. This was deeper, smarter, angry. Thousands of pairs of bioluminescent eyes snapped open in the darkness, fixing on the Concord ship with terrifying focus. The Skitterers weren't retreating. They were gathering, and they weren't looking at the humans. They were looking at the Concord. The lead officer's synthesized voice lost its smoothness, cracking with something like alarm. Containment breach. Full alert. But it was too late. The Skitterers, the planet's relentless predators, surged forward. Not towards the humans, but towards the sleek, blue-armored figures who had just declared the war over. The Concord officers raised their weapons, energy bolts lancing out, vaporizing the front ranks. But for every Skitterer felled, 10 more took its place. They moved with a terrifying coordination, swarming the Envoy ship, scaling its smooth hull, their claws finding purchase where human weapons could not. Chaos erupted. Humans scrambled for cover, caught between the sudden, inexplicable fury of the Skitterers and the panicked fire of the Concord. Aris grabbed Kale's arm, dragging her behind a shattered bulkhead. What in the hell is happening? Kale's eyes were wide with terror and dawning, horrifying comprehension. The disk commander, it wasn't a beacon, it was a key to them. The Concord Envoy ship shuddered violently. A section of its hull buckled under the sheer weight and ferocity of the Skitterer assault. Alarms wailed from within. The lead officer, now fighting desperately, its smooth armor cracking under chitinous blows, turned its visor towards Aris one last time. The synthesized voice was ragged, stripped of its condescension, replaced by raw alien fear. You awakened them? The planet's true guardians. The Concord's fail-safe. Before Aris could process the words, a massive Skitterer, larger than any he'd ever seen, lunged from the shadows. Its pincer closed around the Concord officer's torso with a sickening crunch of chitin and armor. The officer's scream was cut short, replaced by the wet tearing of flesh. The last thing Aris saw before diving for deeper cover was the Concord Envoy ship, its elegant lines now swarming with a living chitinous cancer, beginning to list, smoke pouring from its ruptured hull. And the Skitterers, they weren't stopping. They were turned, their countless eyes glowing with that same angry green light, fixed on the human survivors huddled in the ruins. The war hadn't ended. It had just changed sides. And humanity was caught in the crossfire of a truth they were never meant to know. The Concord Envoy ship burned. Not with the clean fire of plasma, but with the greasy, acrid smoke of chitinous bodies and melting alien alloys. The Skitterers, having torn the sleek vessel apart with terrifying efficiency, now milled around the wreckage, their bioluminescent eyes casting an eerie, shifting green glow over the battlefield. The rain hissed as it struck the hot metal and the cooling corpses of the Concord officers, but they weren't attacking the humans. Not yet. They stood in a loose, watchful perimeter, their postures tense, almost expectant, as if waiting for a signal. Aris Thorn crouched behind a collapsed section of ferrocrete, pulse rifle held tight, his mind reeling. Guardians? Failsafe? The Concord officer's dying words echoed, clashing violently with 3 centuries of ingrained hatred. The Skitterers weren't mindless predators. They were controlled, programmed, by the Concord. Kale pressed close beside him, her breath coming in short gasps. Commander? What do we do? They're just watching us. Stay down. Stay quiet, Aris hissed, his eyes scanning the alien horde. The sheer intelligence in their stillness was more unnerving than their usual frenzied attacks. They know we're here, they're not rushing in. That means they're not acting on instinct. He thought of the disc, the symbol, the before-time tombs. The Concord lied. About everything. The war, Veridia, us. A low, chittering sound different from the others came from nearby. Aris spun, rifle up to see a small group of Skitterers cautiously approaching their position. Not aggressively, almost hesitantly, smaller than the rest, its carapace bearing unique, swirling patterns of silver amidst the green stepped slightly ahead. It raised a forelimb, not in threat but in a gesture that mirrored the Concord officer's earlier condescending wave. But this felt different, less command, more inquiry. Aris's finger tightened on the trigger. Every instinct screamed to fire. These were the monsters that had killed his parents, his friends, countless generations of his people. But the Concord's presence, their fear, the shattered disk, it created a terrifying cognitive dissonance. What if they're not the enemy? Kale, he whispered, never taking his eyes off the silver-marked Skitterer. Remember the old stories? The ones the elders told about the first Watchers? Before the Great Silence? Kale frowned, confused. The myths about the planet protecting its children. Commander, that's just... Look at them. Aris cut her off, his voice low and intense. They attacked the Concord first. They ignored us until the Concord showed up and started talking about surrender and the war being over. They protected us from them. He gestured subtly towards the burning wreck. The Concord called them guardians. A sail-safe. The silver-marked Skitterer took another step closer. It lowered its limb and tapped the ground twice with a claw. Then it pointed, not at Aris but at the distant, jagged peaks of the Razorback Mountains. The location of the largest before-time tomb, a place humans avoided, deemed cursed. Aris's breath caught. The Tomb of Whispers. Legends said it held the truth of the before-time. The truth of why. Kale, Aris said, a desperate plan forming in his mind, born of equal parts hope and terror. We need to get to the tomb, now before the Concord sends more, or before these things decide we're not worth protecting. But the perimeter, the storm, and them, Cal gestured at the watching Skitterers. The Concord ship is down, their comms are probably fried. We have a window, and they, Aris nodded towards the silver-marked Skitterer, which was now making a series of soft clicking sounds, might just be our only way through them. He took a deep breath, the Veridian air burning his lungs. Trust the myth, Kale, for once. Slowly, deliberately, Aris lowered his rifle. He held his hands up, palms open, in the universal gesture of non-aggression. He met the multifaceted eyes of the silver-marked Skitterer. The silence stretched, thick with the tension of millennia of misunderstanding. Then the Skitterer let out a single soft chitter. It turned and began to move away from the outpost, towards the mountains, pausing every few meters to look back, ensuring they followed. It was an invitation, or a trap? Aris looked at Kyle. She swallowed hard, then gave a single sharp nod. Survival had taught them to read the land, the weather, the predators. Now they had to learn to read the enemy that wasn't. "Move," Aris ordered, his voice barely a whisper. Quiet as ghosts, they slipped from the ruins, shadows among shadows, following the silver-marked guide through the churning mass of Skitterers. The larger creatures parted before them, their glowing eyes tracking their passage with unnerving focus, but no aggression. It was like walking through a forest of statues, each one a potential death sentence that chose for reasons unknown to let them pass. The acid rain stung their exposed skin, but the fear of the Skitterers was a colder, deeper chill. Aboard the Whisper of Accord, High Arbiter Zor'lak watched the sensor feed from Veridia Prime with mounting fury. The image was chaotic. Thermal blooms from the burning Envoy, the frantic energy signatures of the Skitterer swarm, the faint, fading life signs of his officers, and two small, persistent human signatures moving rapidly away from the outpost, deeper into the Razorback Mountains. Sub-Executor, Vel. Zor'lak's voice vibrated with controlled rage. Explain this catastrophic failure. How did primitive Deathworlders compromise a Tier 3 Envoy and its complement? Velen's limbs trembled slightly as he manipulated the data streams. The initial report, before comms were severed, indicated the humans possessed a resonance key, an artifact from the pre-containment era. It appears to have activated the planetary defense matrix. Activated. Zor'lak pulsed a dissonant harmonic of disbelief. The matrix is dormant. It was deactivated after the uprising. Its protocols are locked. Unless, Vel hesitated, his voice dropping to a rustle. Unless the key bypassed the deactivation protocols. The humans, they may have accessed the Tomb of Whispers. Zor'lak went utterly still. The Tomb of Whispers, repository of the Concord's original sin. The place where the truth of the Deathworlder containment, the truth that it wasn't containment but erasure, was physically encoded. A truth buried so deep, even most Concord citizens believed the sanitized history of a quelled uprising. The humans must not reach it, Zor'lak commanded, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. Scorch the mountain range, level it if you must. Obliterate the tomb and everyone within it. There can be no witnesses. No. Remember it. But Arbiter, Velen protested, a rare note of dissent in his tone. The energy signature required, it would violate the prime directive of non-intervention. The galaxy, Zor'lak interrupted, his multifaceted eyes fixing on Velen with chilling intensity, will believe what we tell it to believe, as it always has. The Deathworlders are a relic. Their extinction is inevitable and convenient. Deploy the cleansing lance. Authorization Zor'lak Prime. Velen bowed his head, the light glinting off his obsidian carapace. As you command, Arbiter. The order was given. A weapon of unimaginable power, designed to sterilize planets from orbit, began its activation sequence deep within the Whisper of Accord. The climb into the Razorbacks was a descent into a different kind of hell. The acid rain intensified, eating at their armor. The thin air burned their lungs. The path, guided by the silver-marked Skitterer, led them through narrow canyons and treacherous scree slopes, where predators far worse than Skitterers lurked in the shadows, things with too many eyes and jaws that unhinged like snakes. But the Skitterer guide moved with uncanny knowledge, leading them around ambushes, through hidden passes, its chittering warnings saving them more than once. Aris found himself watching the creature, not with fear but with a dawning, reluctant respect. Its movements were efficient, purposeful. It wasn't just guiding them, it was protecting them. The myth of the first Watchers. Could it be true? Had the planet itself, through these creatures, been trying to shield humanity from the Concord all along? Had the attacks on the outposts been tests, or attempts to drive them away from Concord's surveillance? They reached the entrance to the Tomb of Whispers as the first streaks of false dawn painted the sky. It wasn't a grand structure, but a fissure in the mountainside, partially obscured by a waterfall of acidic runoff that hissed and steamed. The silver-marked Skitterer stopped at the entrance, turned to them and let out a series of complex clicks and chitters. Then, with a final, almost gentle tap of its claw on Aris's armored boot, it turned and melted back into the rocks, disappearing as silently as it had appeared. Aris and Kale exchanged a look. This was it, the heart of the mystery. The source of the truth that could save them, or damn them utterly. The interior of the tomb was cool, dry, and utterly silent. Bioluminescent fungi cast a soft blue-green light on walls covered in intricate carvings. Not human, not Skitterer, but something older, smoother, more geometric. Concord glyphs. They walked deeper, the air growing thick with the weight of forgotten time. Finally, they reached a vast central chamber. In the center, floating in a column of shimmering energy, was a massive crystalline structure, pulsing with a soft internal light. Data, history, truth. Kale approached it cautiously, her hand hovering over a console covered in the same shifting glyphs as the disk. It's a memory core. Pre-containment. I think I can interface with it. My neural lace has some residual protocols from the old salvage tech. Do it, Aris said, his voice tight. Find out what they did to us. Kale placed her hands on the console. The glyphs flared to life, projecting a holographic image into the chamber. Not of Concord officials or Skitterers, but of humans. Humans in sleek, advanced uniforms, standing proudly on starships, on verdant worlds, on space stations glittering with light. A thriving spacefaring civilization. Then the image shifted. Concord warships, sleek and predatory, descended upon human colonies, not with warnings, with annihilation, orbital bombardments, atmospheric incineration, genocidal strikes. The narration in a calm, chillingly bureaucratic Concord voice explained, the Deathworlder species exhibits extreme aggression, unpredictable social structures, and a dangerous propensity for rapid technological escalation. Assessment. Uncontainable. Directive. Implement protocol oblivion. Erase from historical record. Designate Veridia Prime as final repository. Deploy planetary defense matrix, Skitterer bioforms, to contain and eliminate any survivors. Maintain historical narrative. Deathworlder uprising quelled. War concluded. Aris felt the world tilt again. But this time it was a physical blow. He staggered back, bile rising in his throat. It wasn't a war they lost. It was a genocide they survived. The Skitterers weren't the enemy. They were the executioners. The Concord left behind, programmed to finish the job. The attacks on the outposts, they were the matrix malfunctioning. Or perhaps over centuries, the bioforms had developed a rudimentary empathy, a recognition of the humans not as targets but as fellow prisoners of the Concord's lie. The silver-marked one, had it been trying to help them remember? Kale gasped, tears streaming down her face as she watched footage of her ancestral homeworld. Kepler 4422b, the name forbidden but the image unmistakable, being reduced to molten slag by Concord energy beams. They just wiped us out. Called it containment. The hologram shifted again, showing the Concord Envoy arriving on Veridia centuries ago, deploying the final containment protocols, activating the Skitterer matrix, and broadcasting the false historical record across the galaxy. The war was over. Humanity was extinct, case closed. Then a new image flickered. A Concord warship, identical to the whisper of a chord in orbit. A targeting reticule locking onto the Razorback Mountains. A weapon charging. A beam of pure, annihilating energy. The cleansing lance, Kale whispered, horror dawning. They're going to erase the tomb. Erase us. Erase the truth. Aris's mind raced. They had minutes, maybe seconds. The outpost was gone. Their people were scattered, vulnerable. The Concord ship in orbit was a god of destruction, and the only allies they had were the very creatures programmed to kill them. He looked at Kale, her face pale with terror, but her eyes burning with the same fire that had kept humanity alive for 3 centuries. We can't let them erase it, he said, his voice low and hard as Veridian iron. The truth dies here. We all die for real this time. But how? We have nothing. No ships, no weapons that can reach orbit. Aris's gaze fell on the crystalline core, still pulsing with the stolen history of his people. An idea, desperate and insane, sparked in his mind. "Maybe we don't need to reach orbit," he said, a grim smile touching his lips. "Maybe we just need to make enough noise that the whole galaxy has to listen." He pointed to the console. "Gale, can you access the tomb's external comms? The old deep space array? The one they used before time?" His eyes widened. It's probably fried. Buried under rock and time." "Probably," Aris agreed. "But it's our only shot. If we can broadcast this," he gestured to the hologram of the Genocide, "on an open omnidirectional frequency, if even one ship outside the Concord hears it, it would shatter the Concord's legitimacy." Kale breathed, understanding dawning. "It would be proof of their greatest crime." "Exactly. Do it. Now. Pump everything we have into that signal. Raw data, the holograms, the logs, everything." Kale's fingers flew over the console, bypassing fried circuits, rerouting power from the tomb's geothermal taps, jury-rigging connections with trembling hands. Sparks flew. The crystalline core pulsed brighter, strained. Outside, the sky began to lighten unnaturally, not with dawn but with the gathering energy of the cleansing lance. "Almost got it," Kale cried. "Signal is weak, but it's broadcasting, on the old emergency band. It'll be faint, but it's out there." Aris grabbed her arm. "Then we run. Now." They sprinted from the tomb, bursting out into the acid dawn just as the sky ripped open. A beam of pure white light, wider than the mountains themselves, lanced down from the heavens. It struck the peak above the tomb with the force of a supernova. The mountain didn't explode, it vaporized. Rock, ice, the ancient tomb, all consumed in an instant of blinding, silent annihilation. The shockwave hit them like a physical wall, throwing them to the ground, the heat searing their backs even through their armor. They scrambled up, coughing in the choking dust and steam. The Razorback Peak was gone. A smoking crater glowed with molten rock. Where the tomb had been, the cleansing lance had done its work. But Kale was already checking her wrist comm, her face lit by its screen. The signal, it got out. For 3 seconds, before the blast took the array. It's propagating. Deep space. It might reach somewhere." Aris looked up at the sky, now clear of the beam but still shimmering with residual energy. The whisper of a chord hung there, a dark, silent sentinel. They'd broadcast the truth, but they were still on Veridia, still hunted, and the Concord knew they were alive. Knew they knew. Then, a new sound, not from the sky, from the ground, from the forests, from the canyons. A rising tide of chittering, deeper and more resonant than before. Thousands, millions. The Skitterers were converging, not on the humans, on the mountains, on the crater where the tomb had been. They gathered in a vast silent circle around the devastation, their bioluminescent eyes fixed on the sky on the Concord ship. The silver-marked Skitterer emerged from the rocks near Aris and Kale. It didn't look at them, it looked up at the whisper of a chord, and let out a long, mournful, yet defiant chitter that echoed across the entire range. It was a sound of grief for the lost tomb, and a declaration of war. The planetary defense matrix wasn't just activated, it was enraged. Aris understood. The Skitterers weren't just guardians of the planet. They were guardians of the truth, and the Concord had just tried to erase it. He turned to Kale, a fierce, desperate hope burning in his eyes. "They're not our enemies, Kale. They never were, they're our army." Kale looked at the sea of chitinous bodies, their eyes glowing with shared fury, then back at the Concord ship. A slow, grim smile spread across her face. "Then let's give them a target." High above, on the whisper of a chord, Sub-Executor Veln watched the sensor feed. The human signatures were still active, and the Skitterer biosignatures, they were coalescing, forming patterns, military patterns, surrounding the human signatures, but oriented outward, towards the ship. "Arbiter?" Velen's voice was tight with a fear he couldn't suppress. "The Matrix, it's not containing the humans, it's allying with them. The broadcast, it may have corrupted the core protocols." Zor'lak stared at the display, The image of the united front of humans and Skitterers sending a chill through his chitina's frame. The unthinkable was happening. The failsafe had turned on its masters. The relic was fighting back. "Deploy all orbital assets," Zor'lak commanded. His voice, devoid of its usual calm, edged with something dangerously close to panic. "Scorch the entire continent. Leave nothing but glass. And yes, Arbiter. Prepare the Whisper for immediate jump. We may need to relocate the historical narrative." But it was too late for narratives. Below, Aris raised his pulse rifle, not in surrender but in salute, towards the silver-marked Skitterer. But the war hadn't ended centuries ago. It had just begun anew, and this time humanity wouldn't be fighting alone. The sky over Veridia Prime became a canvas of fire. Concord dropships, sleek and deadly as obsidian wasps, screamed down from the whisper of a chord, unleashing torrents of plasma and kinetic bombardment. Forests ignited. Rivers boiled. The very rock of the continent cracked under the onslaught. The Concord's message was clear. Oblivion. Total. Absolute. But Veridia Prime fought back. From the smoking crater of the Razorbacks, the Skitterers surged. Not as a mindless horde, but as a disciplined, terrifying army. They flowed over the landscape like a living tide of chitin and venom. Guided by the silver-marked leader, Aris had started calling it Silas in his mind. A name that felt right. They used the terrain with preternatural skill, ambushing dropships in narrow valleys, swarming landing parties with coordinated pincer movements, their bioluminescent eyes flashing signals in the smoke and chaos. And amidst them, humanity fought. Not from fortified outposts, but as guerrilla cells moving like ghosts through the devastation. Aris and Kale led one such group, using salvaged Concord sidearms and jury-rigged explosives to target the dropship's vulnerable undercarriages and sensor arrays. They weren't soldiers. They were insurgents in their own home, fighting for a truth the galaxy had tried to bury. Cal left flank, 2 skimmers coming in low. Aris yelled over the din of explosions and Skitterer chitters. He primed a magnetic pulse grenade scavenged from a downed Concord drone, and hurled it. It clung to the lead skimmers. The EMP blast fried its systems. It spiraled into a canyon, exploding in a fireball that lit up the acid rain. Kale laid down, covering fire with a Concord pulse rifle, its recoil jarring her shoulder. "They're adapting, Aris. Their targeting is getting smarter." "Then we get smarter, faster," Aris retorted, reloading. He saw Silas, perched on a ridge, directing a wave of Skitterers to flank a Concord heavy infantry squad. The humans and Skitterers moved in eerie synchronicity, humans drawing fire while Skitterers closed in for the kill with terrifying efficiency. The myth was real. The planet was fighting for them. But the Concord had the high ground. Literally, the whisper of a chord hung in orbit, a silent god of judgment, directing the carnage below, and Zor'lak, watching the battle unfold on his bridge, felt a cold dread seep into his core. The humans were broadcasting. The Skitterers were coordinated. The truth was out there, propagating through the void like a virus. His perfect, contained historical narrative was unraveling. "Velun. Status on the cleansing lance recharge," Zor'lak demanded, his voice 70%, Arbiter. "The geothermal feedback from the first strike is causing instability in the primary capacitor. Unacceptable. We need to sterilize the entire northern continent. Now." "Arbiter," Velton's voice held a new desperate edge. "Sensors detect multiple FTL signatures emerging from the Oort cloud. Unidentified vessels? They're responding to the broadcast." Zor'lak's multifaceted eyes snapped to the tactical display. 3 blips, then 5, then a dozen, resolving into the distinct signatures of non-Concord warships. The angular, brutalist designs of the Cathar hegemony, the organic curves of the Sylvari collective, the jagged spines of the Free Systems Alliance, ships from factions that had always chafed under Concord authority, factions that would leap at proof of Concord treachery. The broadcast, Zor'lak breathed, the word tasting like ash. The 3-second burst of raw genocide footage had done its work. It had reached ears that wanted to hear it. The galaxy was coming to Veridia. "Scramble all defense drones. Raise shields to maximum. Prepare for engagement," Zor'lak's command was laced with a fear he hadn't felt since the early days of the Convergence War. This wasn't just about containing Deathworlders anymore. This was about the survival of the Concord itself. On the surface, the battle reached a fever pitch. A Concord heavy cruiser deployed from the Whisper began a low-altitude strafing run, its main cannon carving a path of molten ruin towards Aris's position. Silas let out a piercing chitter and hundreds of Skitterers launched themselves into the air, not at the cruiser but at the smaller drone escorts swarming around it. They clung to the drones, shorting out systems, tearing through armor with their claws, creating chaos in the cruiser's protective screen. Kale led the canyon. Now! Aris grabbed her arm, dragging her towards a deep fissure in the rock. They dove in just as the cruiser's main cannon fired. The ground behind them vanished in a plume of superheated rock and vaporized Skitterers. The shockwaves slammed into them, knocking the breath from their lungs. Coughing in the dust, Aris looked up. The cruiser was turning, lining up for another pass. They were trapped. Silas and the remaining Skitterers were scattered, overwhelmed by the drone swarm. Then, a new sound tore through the sky. Not Concord engines. Something deeper, heavier, angrier. A shadow, vast and jagged, blotted out the sun. A Kethar hegemony dreadnought, its hull scarred from 100 battles, dropped out of FTL right above the Concord cruiser. It didn't hail. It didn't warn. It opened fire. Energy beams, thick as ancient trees, lanced down, punching through the Concord cruiser's shields like paper. The cruiser exploded in a silent, sun-bright fireball that momentarily turned the acid rain to steam. Debris rained down like burning hail. More ships arrived. Sylvari fighters, swift and silent, danced through the Concord drone swarm, their bioenergy weapons dissolving drones into glowing mist. Free Systems gunships, bristling with weapons, laid down suppressing fire on Concord ground positions. The tide had turned. The galaxy had answered the call of the dead. Aris stared up at the chaotic ballet of destruction in the sky, a fierce, almost painful joy surging through him. They weren't alone. The truth had winged, but his joy was short-lived. A proximity alarm blared on his wrist comm. He looked down. A single massive signature was detaching from the whisper of Accord. Not a drop ship. Something else. Sleek, fast, radiating immense power. It was heading straight for their position. For him, Zor'lak, Aris whispered, recognizing the signature of the Arbiter's personal command skiff. The architect of their genocide wasn't fleeing. He was coming down to finish the job himself. Kale, get to the fallback point, rally the others. I'll hold him. Aris shoved her towards a tunnel entrance. No. Aris, you can't. That's an order, Lieutenant, Aris roared, his eyes blazing. Go. Now. Tell them. Veridia fights. Kale hesitated for a heartbeat, tears mixing with the grime on her face, then turned and ran. Aris turned to face the descending skiff, raising his Concord pulse rifle. It was a pea shooter against what was coming. But it was all he had. He wouldn't die hiding. The skiff landed with a hiss of repulsors, kicking up a cloud of ash. The ramp lowered. High Arbiter Zor'lak stepped out, not in his usual blue Chaden armor, but in a suit of obsidian black battle plate, crackling with energy shields. He carried no visible weapon, but his presence radiated lethal authority. His multifaceted eyes fixed on Aris, filled with cold, alien fury. Deathworlder, Zor'lak's voice was a synthesized snarl, stripped of all pretense of harmony. You have caused irreparable damage. The Concord's peace is shattered because of your persistence. Aris spat blood onto the ash-covered ground. Peace, built on lies and genocide, isn't peace, Arbiter. It's a tomb, and you just dug your own. Your species was a mistake, a dangerous anomaly. We corrected it. Zor'lak took a step forward, energy crackling around his fists. Now I will correct the final error. He moved with blinding speed. A blur of black armor. Aris fired, the pulse bolts splashing harmlessly against Zor'lak's shields. A backhanded blow sent Aris flying, his ribs screaming in protest as he crashed into the canyon wall. He tasted blood, struggled to rise. Zor'lak loomed over him, raising a hand that now glowed with concentrated energy. Oblivion human. As it should have been 300 cycles ago. Aris closed his eyes, waiting for the end. But the killing blow didn't come. Instead, a shadow fell over him. A massive, chitinous shadow. Silas. The silver-marked Skitterer stood between Aris and the Arbiter, its body coiled, bioluminescent eyes blazing with protective fury. It let out a guttural roar that shook the canyon walls. Zor'lak paused, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. Yo? The fail-safe? You defy your programming? Silas didn't answer with words. It answered with action. It lunged, not with mindless rage, but with the precision of a master predator. Claws like monomolecular blades slashed at Zor'lak's shields. The energy flared, holding, but the impact staggered the Arbiter. Aris saw his chance. Ignoring the pain, he scrambled for his fallen rifle. He saw the weak point, the joint where Zor'lak's helmet met his neck armor. Momentarily exposed as he twisted to fend off Silas's attack, he fired, not at the shield, at the joint. The pulse bolt struck true. Zor'lak's shield flickered violently, overloading from the combined assault. The helmet seal cracked, a hiss of escaping atmosphere. The Arbiter stumbled back, clutching his neck, a dark ichor seeping between his fingers. Silas pressed the advantage, driving Zor'lak's back towards the edge of the canyon. The Arbiter, wounded, disoriented, activated his skiff's recall beacon. The ramp began to rise. With a final desperate chitter, Silas launched itself, not at Zor'lak, but at the rising ramp. It slammed into the mechanism, jamming it open just as the skiff's engines roared to life. The skiff lurched upwards, Silas clinging to the ramp, its claws scrabbling for purchase. Zor'lak, seeing his escape threatened, raised his energy-charged hand towards the Skitterer, but Aris was already moving. He threw his last magnetic pulse grenade, not at Zor'lak, but at the skiff's main repulsor array. The EMP blast hit. The skiff's engines sputtered and died. It dropped like a stone, crashing back to the canyon floor in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. Silas was thrown clear, landing hard but unharmed. Zor'lak was trapped inside the wreckage, his battle armor sparking, his movements sluggish. Aris limped over to the wreck, pulse rifle aimed at the crumpled cockpit. Silas stood beside him, a silent, chitinous guardian. Zor'lak's helmet retracted, revealing a face of chitinous plates and multifaceted eyes filled with pain and a dawning, terrible understanding. He looked at Aris, then at Silas, then up at the sky where the battle still raged. But now the Concord ships were clearly losing, being driven back by the Coalition fleet. You broadcast the truth, Zor'lak rasped, blood kept bubbling at his mouth. The galaxy knows. Yeah, Aris said, his voice rough but steady. They know you tried to erase us. They know you called it peace. Zor'lak's eyes dimmed. The Concord will fall because of Deathworlders. There was no malice left, only a hollow, defeated acceptance. The cycle repeats. Aris looked down at the architect of his people's suffering. Broken and dying in the mud of the world he tried to sterilize. He felt no triumph, only a profound, weary sadness. The cost had been too high, too many graves. He lowered his rifle. No Arbiter, he said quietly. The cycle ends here, on Veridia, where it began. He turned his back on Zor'lak, on the dying symbol of a corrupt peace. He looked at Silas, who chittered softly, a sound that felt like gratitude. Understanding. Then he looked up at the sky. The Concord fleet was in full retreat, harried by the Coalition ships. The whisper of Accord was gone, jumped to safety, but its legacy was shattered. Below, human survivors were emerging from hiding, joining with Skitterer groups, tending to the wounded, both human and chitinous. The acid rain still fell, but the air felt different, cleaner, lighter. Kale ran up, her face streaked with soot and tears, but her eyes shining. Aris, the Coalition, they're hailing us. They want to talk. They believe us. Aris put a hand on her shoulder, then reached out and gently touched the carapace of Silas. The Skitterer leaned into the touch, a soft chitter rumbling in its chest. He looked out over the scarred, smoking landscape of Veridia Prime, the death world that had been their prison, their crucible, and now their home. The war hadn't ended centuries ago. It had been a lie, but this war, the war for truth, for survival, for a future, this war was just beginning. And humanity, forged in the fires of oblivion, alongside the guardians of the planet that refused to let them be forgotten, would face it together. Aris Thorn took a deep breath of the harsh, metallic air. It tasted like freedom, like a future written not by victors but by survivors. "Tell them," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 300 years and the hope of 1,000 more, "that Veridia Prime is open for business, and we have a lot of history to set straight." High above, the Coalition fleet held position, a silent promise against the void. Below, humans and Skitterers began the long work of healing, of building, of remembering. The galaxy had learned the truth. The war hadn't ended. Humanity had simply been waiting for the rest of the universe to catch up to their fight, and they were just getting started.